Welcome to episode 41 of building a 2D game in Flutter with multiplayer support. In the last episode, we basically synced the client finally with the server successfully. We fixed some rounding errors, and but this client is basically now updated from the server, from our authoritative server, and basically we have the game loop. The game loop itself is taking at 20 milliseconds in the server, but the messaging, basically the amount of time we update the client is much smaller. So we actually update the client only every 1.5 seconds, and that's on purpose to surface some problems that we might still have, and yeah, basically to be able to debug this easier and so on. So another thing that we started doing was we were looking at how can we now send the inputs to the server from the client, right? So basically, how can we make sure that when we rotate, that the client actually knows that we rotated, and then obviously once we are, let me try to make this a little smaller here. Once we are actually rotate it and then apply thrust, that we move in the right direction and basically send that to the server as well. So for now, we were just worrying about the angle of the glare, right? When we change the rotation, and the thing is, we didn't want to send basically the rotation changes. We didn't want to send like, oh, the key was pressed, or maybe the touch was moved, and therefore now we should rotate. We wanted to basically just update once in a while, like what is our current rotation. So that's what we did here. We have a player inputs thing, a class here that we already implemented the pack method and the unpack method. So basically the client will pack the player inputs, and the server will unpack them. And then we already had an input synchronizer implemented as well, which basically is responsible for regularly updating the server with the latest client inputs. So basically, this is a function that basically we'll call in order to update the server. So we can actually see that it's right here. And what we basically do is we update this as part of the game loop. And then we kind of look like if it's time to sync. Right now we sync every time. We might improve this to say, well, if nothing changed, actually we don't need to sync the server. But that is later. For now, we can just say we always do that. And I don't think we did call this yet from anywhere. So we need to call this in the client game. So if we go to the client game, when we have the update here, but we have the input processor update, and then we also need to basically have the input synchronizer. We need to also update that. Now, the thing that we're missing obviously here is the input synchronizer. So we have an input processor, but we don't have an input synchronizer yet. So let's just add that here. And now when we try to actually implement that, we'll see that we're missing something over here, which is important, which we'll need. And that is the update method, right? So the sync interval we can actually get from the game props, right? So let's make a game props, and I think we already have player sync interval in milliseconds. So we're saying that every 100 milliseconds we'll update the server. Okay, that's fine. But we still need that method submit player inputs, right? So this method right here. So when we create that client game, we actually then need to pass that. And we can see that we're creating this game here. And at that point, we should still have access to the, let me see, actually, if we do have access, we should have access to this client. But we do actually not expose that as a field. And so we may have to do that, right? So when we actually then here create the game, we want to basically pass that in. So let's just actually make that a field first. So we have the client, and instead of assigning this to a local variable, we update this field. And then in here now, when we create the game state, the client game, sorry, we can actually pass it in. And now you can start seeing like this is getting a little bit busy with parameters. So now I actually want to go ahead and I want those to be named, just to be able to see what's what a little easier. So so all of these are going to be required. So let's just do that. And if you put a comma over here, then it's going to format it the way I like it. So now required we have to import our custom required. And the explanation is in an earlier episode. It's because required does not exist in Dart in general. But basically now what we want to do, we want to also say require this function. So this function, actually we don't necessarily need to make this a field, right? Because we just basically will pass it in to the input synchronizer. So we can just basically say we require this function to be defined, but it's not a field. So it is complaining. All right, let's see what it's complaining. Okay, so yeah, we're not using that yet, right? But now basically what we can do, once we have that, we can now, maybe right after we create this processor, we can create the input processor as well. The input synchronizer. So let's do that here. Input synchronizer is a new input synchronizer. And now we're passing in the player inputs, right? The submit player inputs, okay. And then we're going to pass in game props dot something with ms. Let's see, there was player sync interval milliseconds, right? Okay, so now let's see why it's complaining. Yeah, all right, so so something weird really happened. So let's just undo that. Oh, because this is happening kind of here. So we should put a comma here. Right, and then maybe put a comma here too. Okay, so this looks really kind of confusing because this is actually happening outside the constructor body, and then here we are inside the constructor body. It's a little bit confusing looking, but that's the only way I can make this a final. Okay, so we got the input synchronizer, and now basically we need to also use that and say once we have the input processor, do input synchronizer update. But the thing is, most likely we want to actually do that after we run the game controller, because we want basically to pass in the latest player model. And now it gets interesting, right? How do we get our current player? And so we have that already here, fortunately. We have the client player because we want to basically update whatever changed regarding the inputs in our player. And now we're only passing a client player in here. And we're also allowing always these keys to be accepted, but that might change in the future. Like we might have to pass a little more here, or we might even have the input synchronizer decide if maybe the updating, like let's say a thrust or whatever, if that's even allowed, right? Because if we only send it every 100 milliseconds, we can't obviously show on the client side that we applied thrust, versus the server didn't even get that information. So on the server side, we didn't apply thrust. But for now, we're starting really simple. We just want to basically see if we can at least like update our angle to the server. And so we keep updating this, right? And we only send something when it's important. So like basically once if you're still like not wanting to sync, this update method basically does nothing, right? Okay, so now let's see why it's still complaining here. Can start. Okay, so now we need to rename all these things. But I prefer that to having unnamed parameters, and then we need to import this. So that one I don't like too much. I don't like this at all because it lets now the whole like transport thing is bleeding into this. So I don't like this. What we'll do actually, we'll have this function and we won't pack it yet. So we'll have it like this and we'll pack it somewhere else because I don't want the packed stuff, all this proto buff stuff to bleed into our client game, which really shouldn't have an idea about this kind of stuff, communicating to the server and so on. That should not be here. So I didn't even like to use that type here. So when we now we go back to our game here, so we need to say arena. I think let's see, what do we name all these things? We had game and client ID. Okay. And client ID. Okay. So what we're still missing though is one required parameter, and now since our required annotation is not activated, like we don't get a warning here, normally we would, and that we're actually missing a function. So what we want to do then is, so the client, we want to actually create something on the client that allows us to sync this stuff. So we want to actually create this function, submit this function here. We want to create that, submit player inputs. So we already have one here, but this one basically wants packed player inputs. So now what I don't here obviously is that we are starting to refer to unpacked player inputs. We could convert it in here. Maybe we'll do that. So basically, submit player inputs will basically take the inputs, right? And then we basically call client dot player inputs, and then we pack them. So now we basically kept. So now we have one central place that knows about everything, right? And obviously, like it's still a little bit, much that we are doing here now in this main file, but we can change that later. So for now, I think it's definitely cleaner though. Well, let's just put the comma here. That's a little bit cleaner though than having the client know about player inputs that are actually only used by the game itself, or vice versa. So now we can submit the player inputs, and let me make sure that we don't have errors here. We don't. Okay. Now what we can do, we can go to the server and kind of listen to this and actually update the player accordingly. So let's look at how we would do that. I'm going to let's see. I'm going to close a bunch of things. So well, actually, those are still important. And we're going to go over here, and we're just going to open the server game, or actually the server game service. And you can see here that when we sync client and game states, we get this playing client event thing. And that's basically the one that is used by the client to update, basically to send us these player inputs. So we already have a subscription, and that's here, and we're basically not doing anything. So we're getting the game, and we have the client as well. And so basically we need to somehow update the inputs for this client, right? So, and if you look at the event, we have the playing client, and that should have. Hold on, I'm a little bit. So let's actually look at our proto to make sure we are doing the right thing here. So we have the proto, and we have the packed player inputs, which are part of that. So it's actually not the client; it's actually the player inputs. Okay, so we can inputs equals event.player inputs. Okay, so and you can see that they are packed at this point, and what we need to do, we need to unpack them. And so we do player inputs, and we're doing all this packing and unpacking because we want to basically save space when we send things around. So we are kind of packing doubles into ints and so on, right? Let me just, so I think we need to import this. Okay. And now we should have an unpack. Yeah, there you go. So now we can unpack these. So now we got inputs. So now we got the angle here, right? We should have the angle here now. Yeah, there you go, right? So now we need to tell the game about player inputs like this do says, right? So game dot, and there's no such thing as updating a client. So we need to add that to our game. So let's do that over here. We have a server game. And so we have add client here. But we don't have, so we have players. So the game owns the list of clients. But then who has, so then we have a game loop. And I think in the game loop, we can actually find the players. Let's see. So we got players, add player, okay. And so the game controller. So we're getting down and down into this where we actually need to add a method to update the player. So we can see here that we have a game controller that that is shared, right? But the this game controller basically runs on the client on the server side. So now we got all these controllers, but in a way, I don't want to do it this way. I don't want to go through the game controller because we're really just kind of overriding things, right? We're basically just saying unimportant, like what the game actually did. We need to actually just update the player. And the thing is though that we don't have direct access to the players here, which maybe is a good thing. But maybe in the game controller. We need, so we have the player controller here, but we also have players. So let me try to see where, so when we update, we have game state.player. Okay, so it's in the game state. We can get the game state from the controller, that's fine. And I bet when we create this controller, we actually also access a game state. So now we can basically say, do we want to do this through the game controller or do we want to access the game state directly? That's basically just a kind of a philosophical thing to decide. I would argue that we probably should go through the controller and just update that directly. Or we could say we can schedule the updates and have them apply on tick. That's the other option we have, right? So basically, whenever we tick here, instead of just saying update the game controller, also say, by the way, we have these pending client updates that we also need to consider, right? So I want to keep things simple for now. And so what I will do, I will actually say, we'll update this in sync. So what we'll do, we'll put an update player here. And so we don't know what the player model is yet. What we do know is we know what the inputs are, but we don't know for whom this is unless we look at the client, right? So then we have the final ID is basically client dot player ID or something like that. So ID, client ID, right? So we have the game ID and we have the client ID. So the game ID we already used because that's how we found our game. And then the client ID we can pass in here. And basically that way we can find the player we actually need to update. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have, let's just actually call that inputs because that's what that is. And we're going to get the client ID, which is going to be a string. No, actually not, right? Because I think we made our client IDs just double, yeah, they're ints, right? So client ID, and then we have player inputs. Okay, cool. So now basically, now we can solve this here, or we can solve this in the game controller. And it really isn't not huge difference, but I think it's better to just forward this to the game controller. So we actually add the same method on the game controller as well. And that's where actually we'll implement this. So let's go here. Okay. Actually, since I want to be clear that this is coming from the client, so I'm going to call this sync, and we're going to also rename the other method we have. So now what I want to do is game state, right? Dot. Now we want to get the players, and we're going to get the one with a client ID, right? And for now, all we have to do is the angle is the inputs dot angle, right? Because there's not much more, or at this point there's nothing more that we have to update here. So that actually will update already. So, and obviously what we want to make sure is we want to fail really early, and obviously right now we're crashing here, but in the future the server has to be more resilient and has to figure out what to do in this case. But what we'll do is we'll say that actually the game state players why did you do that? Players has or contains key the client ID, right? Otherwise we'll say player with ID not found, right? So somehow we don't have that player for whatever reason. We don't know why, but that could happen. So we want to at least update this quickly. Okay, or at least we want to fail early, right? So now sync players, we need to go back to where we were. So we had the game controller and we had update player inputs. We're going to name this sync player inputs, and all we're going to do is we're going to call our game controller and sync player inputs, same parameters, and we're done. All right. So, and you can see that this is a really fast operation, so it doesn't cost much time. And so then when then the tick is scheduled and we update the game controller, it will already take into account the angle of the player. Now what I'm going to do is remember how somewhere here in we give it a velocity. We created the game state somewhere, or I'm trying to figure out, because we don't want the player to move now. We don't need to see this anymore. Here we go. So this one, at least we're going to comment it out for now. We just want the player to be like static, not move. And now what should happen is, obviously we need to call it so game, or the game that we found dot. So we need to expose it there as well. So the game itself, which has a hold of the game loop, I think it's a server game we call it, right? So that one also needs the same method. So this, and you can see this is kind of going a little bit through a bunch of redirections, but that way we can keep things really clean. So that should be actually now the game loop. All right, and so now we can call sync player inputs, give it the, let's call it, we can just inline this, the client ID, and then the inputs. All right, so now we should be happy, except that it doesn't know what player inputs are here. And we can now actually go ahead and launch the server first. So let's go ahead and do that. We need the server. And so now that's listening. And then we also want to use a Mac OS thing. That's going to take a little bit. And we just want to launch one game. That's all we need. And then what we'll basically do, we'll rotate. We basically rotate the player, and then it should say rotated. And what I'm going to do is then to prove that this is actually working, I hope it will work right away, which usually is lucky if it does. But if it does work, then I basically will not update, not sync them, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, so snapshot error, something happened on the server. Cannot find game with ID. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so somehow we already ran this. So the game wasn't created yet. So as I said, things never work right away, or very seldom. So basically what's happening is, it seems that the client is already syncing before the game was created. But what we'll do is we relaunch the server, but in debug mode. So we'll stop this guy and we'll relaunch it in debug mode and we'll put a breakpoint where the error occurred here. And also I want to see why this is happening, because we should already have had a play request. So here we should have already gotten this, because otherwise we shouldn't have had a client. So that also means that we should have created that game. So I'm a little bit confused why that game doesn't exist, but that's why we'll debug right now and we'll see how that works. So now we got the actually let me move the, yeah, we can keep it here, it's fine. So we got the server listening, and then we'll restart hot restart our client. Okay, now we're hitting a breakpoint, right? So we got a game created, and that game has game ID, or has this game. So we're sending 0. Okay, so that's the problem. We're not sending the correct game ID, it seems like. So because this is a unique ID, and if I remember correctly, when then we crashed over here, we sent the wrong game ID. Let me see, like, now what's the game ID is. It doesn't want to hover for me. But now the game, I think, is defined. No, it's null. Okay. Let's look at what's going on here. So the game is null because I think the event game ID. Oh, this is okay. So this is not very friendly to debugging. Let's say event.client.game ID is null, 0, not null. And that's the problem, right? Because now if I continue, then it will tell me that it didn't find the game. Right. So, whoa. Okay. So that's, yeah. Okay. So we need to find out why we're not saying the game ID correctly from the client. So let's go. So basically that would be wherever we are sending the inputs, right? So the input processor, input synchronizer, is sending submit player inputs, right? And I think the problem is that we don't set it. That's the problem. So when we submit the inputs, we need to actually have already. Ideally, we would have the client ID in here. We could also have that somewhere else, because we do know there's only one client, like, on the front end, right? So what we can actually do, we can actually go here where we actually submitting it. We should be able to say, well, actually the client should have the ID, right? So let's see. It has a client ID. Okay. So now I think we just forgot to set it. So we set this, and then we say that the client equals, and then what is a client? It's a plain client. Oh, but we do have that already, right? That should be probably this thing. Right? Yeah, and with the comma it looked better. And now let me close this over here, because the generate code makes me nervous. But now this should be fine. And that's like what I don't like about these generated proto classes. They don't basically give you a way. They don't have a constructor where you have to set everything. So basically, they don't give you like really a secure, like, you know, like compile time errors when you forget to set something. So like now we're setting everything. Okay. Which means that we can restart the server, and then we can restart our client as well. Okay, it didn't crash. We can move. So let's see if the server, after 1.5 seconds, it would normally reset it back if it didn't get that message. But it seems like it successfully got the message. So yeah, so okay, let's do that. Let's make sure that that actually works. So what I'll do is in the player, the input sync in this one, I'm just never ever gonna send it. Okay, so that way when we now restart, right? Now if I move, the server should send, you see that? So server sends it back. Okay, because the server never knew that we actually changed something. So now if I change that, and now I move it, right? Now it stays there because the server got the update, right? So that means now we actually successfully are sending the inputs to the server. Okay, I hope that's clear. So that's pretty cool, and we're gonna check that in. So let me just go through all these. All right. Yeah, we changed that a little bit. Yep. Yes, and then we basically just added this kind of method everywhere. Yep. Okay, that looks good. So we can just select all that and commit that. And so basically, I'm gonna call it syncing player inputs to server. For now, all right, so that's good. So that's working. And now the thing is that all we need to do now, well, it sounds like all we need to do, but it's probably going to be another little piece of work. But basically, we need to send now that the applied thrust. So it's going to be Boolean. Okay, maybe they're called bools. And so basically, that one will not be required. We basically will say applied thrust, and by default it's false. So if you don't set it, it's fine. But now we have a problem, right? Because now if we update the player inputs, well, actually, yeah, we don't really have room because the angle will always be set. So we'll always have to pass this in. But now if we don't pass applied thrust, then it will be set to false. So we don't want that. So actually what we want is something like, we want to have something called copy with, where we basically can just easily update parts of the thing. But yeah, so this is a little tricky. So basically what we want to make sure, so if you apply thrust once, right, we don't want to override it with false again. So, and that's why we're going to have a copy with thing. And actually it's not exactly a copy with. It's more like we're almost appending or appending information. Because we basically not allowing you to override. Once the applied thrust is true, we don't allow you to override it anymore. And also it can't be, so maybe we'll do it differently. Maybe we make this required and we'll do it outside of this. So this really just becomes a really dumb data thing, right? So now obviously when we send this, we actually would want to put, we don't want to have a Boolean here. We want to basically pack this into into an int. So, and we already did this somewhere else. So basically, we can call these flags. So basically on the, in our thing here, so the player inputs, we have the angle, but then we also, I don't think we have a peg point or something like that. So yeah, so we basically, it will just basically be a UN32, and it will just basically be the flags of stuff. So that means like, we already went through this in our key state, basically in our input, let me see. We did this basically in our key presses. So in our inputs, where are they? we pretty much already did this, right? So we said like we have a game key, and basically like they're represented as kind of this bit field thing, where we're saying like if none of the keys was pressed, we pass this. And the thing is, we probably won't send this now to the server, but we can use the same thing, same kind of thing as actually I'm going to copy this because it's so similar, and we're going to say player input flags. And so none is this, and then we say this is thrust, and then we have another one that is basically shot, or well, we can call it bullet, except the bullet will not be like that. Well, actually the bullet can be like that because we know where the player is. So that yeah, I want to kind of debate that. So basically, like the thing is that if you're moving this way, right, and we're shooting, I'm saying like we shoot, the server knows where the bullet should be, right? It knows, okay, we're here, and this is where we're pointing, so the bullet should start here, and now it should start animating the bullet and controlling the bullet. However, what could happen is that when we actually send this, yeah, that we're somewhere else, but basically that would also allow cheating, right? So what I'm trying to get to is like we might already in our client prediction, we might already have moved slightly, and we may already have an angle slightly differently, and then when we shoot, the server still thinks maybe we're pointing this way and we're a little bit back, and so then it would basically start the bullet somewhere else. So I was thinking maybe we want to actually tell it where the bullet should start and maybe what the velocity is, but that now would allow cheating, right? Because now I could basically, on my client, I could say, well, you know, my opponent is here, I just fired a bullet here to right there. So I think we actually do want the bullet flag. So for now, that's all the flags we have. And so basically now, so we have a flag, and then we're gonna have flags, and we basically just copy this code almost over. We have the bits, and this is player in, and you know, one might think that maybe since I have to copy this, maybe one should pull out a common class for this, but it's very small and very simple. So basically all we're doing here, we're adding a key. So we can say that if thrust is applied, we're going to add this, and then magically, let me move this over here. Oh, okay, it doesn't want to. Okay, all right, it appears that, yeah, my shortcuts are broken since IntelliJ updated. I decided to just forget about some of my shortcuts. Anyways, what I wanted to do is I wanted to move this over here. All right, good. Now, what we can do is then when we pack it, right? First of all, we need to go back to the proto, and I think we already added the field, and we're going to call it input flags, just to be clear what kind of flags they are, right? And so now we're going to run our regenerator, and now basically we should be able to use those. So now we can say, we can then say like pack these flags, but also we can just do it by hand, or we just write a method. So static and what we actually want to get out is we want to just get the and actually we don't need any of this stuff because we're not gonna, well, actually we might use it as a server on the server. Yeah, we might actually need this. So what we'll do is, but basically we want the bits, right? So we call this pack, and what we'll have to do is we just pass on our player inputs. That's it. And then we can say if inputs.thrust, applied thrust is set, right? Then we say, okay, add add the flag state. So we first of all we have to create some final flags equals player input flags. Right, and then we say flags dot add, and then we add the player input flag dot thrust, and that's just to be consistent. We also call that applied thrust, right? Just to not get confused. Okay, so now we have that, and now what we can do when we're done, right? Obviously there will be more flags, so we add more, but then we return flags dot bits. And then we unpack. And so the question is like, actually this doesn't need to be, you see we can pass bits in here, right? So we can just actually have a method. The only thing, is that we cannot unpack an entire player inputs from this. So this is kind of not really clear. I almost want to have like, yeah, I don't like to have this on here. So basically, what we'll probably do, we'll have this static method, and so we can then say that dot the input flags equals player input flags dot pack, and we're packing from the inputs. We're not packing the entire inputs, right? We're only packing well, it's this, right? I mean, we could also be more clear and say exactly what we're packing. Like we could say, right? We could say bool applied. Maybe that's cleaner. And so then we can say here this. So we just pass in. And now I think it's a little more code, but it's much cleaner, right? Because you're not. This thing has nothing really to do with the entire player inputs. And now when we unpack, we can basically say final applied. So we can, first of all, we get the player input flags back. And we'll pass in the data dot input flags, and that's like the bits basically, right? Name and bits. And then we can say the applied thrust is, so let's like make a variable out of that just to make it a little less crowded there. Applied thrust equals player input flags dot contains, and then the player input flag dot applied thrust, right? And then we can finally put it back together. Okay, so now we added a way to basically send along these flags. And we could have just sent a boolean, would have been much easier. But I would think that the boolean is probably represented as a uint. I'm not even sure. Like I think we looked this up before, but let's just look this up again. So if you say dart size of boolean, does it tell us the size? Yeah, that's not really what I wanted. Well, we could look it up, but it's definitely at least like 8 bits. I would think it's probably at least, probably most likely it's uint32, I would think. So basically what we would waste is like for each boolean, we would basically send along a lot of bits, and here each boolean takes exactly 1 bit, right? There'll be more. So the more we add, we basically already have uint32, so we're actually not losing any space. We can just add more and more booleans until we have 32. Then we run out. Okay, so now we are sending this. But now the thing is, comes to the tricky part here. So the inputs, we get the player angle, and this is where actually we're going to do this piece by piece. So the applied thrust, right, is basically either the player already applied thrust. Oh, hold on, but we don't have that. So it's almost like we need the last inputs. But also we don't. So that's where it's getting a little tricky. So the synchronizer, I don't know if this belongs in synchronizer. Most likely it does because it's time related. Because we want to basically keep around that the player did apply thrust until we finally send something to the server. So what I actually am going to do is I'm going to say bool. It's not a final. And so maybe I'll put it below this. And I say bool apply thrust. Right? And so when we update, we always look if the player applied thrust, even though we were not sending it. So basically applied thrust equals, if you already applied thrust, then like forget it, right? We are done. Or player dot applied thrust force. Okay, so that's weird. We have a force here. And that should not be part of the model. Yeah, so this needs to become Boolean. And I know it used to be Boolean, and then we changed it to that because we were thinking we were going to send the force. We have player flags. Look at that. So we already had something like this. This is what happens when you work on an app for a while and you kind of forget about things. They're not used, so I'm just going to remove this. Are we using it anyway? Yeah, you can kind of see like what's going on here, right? This is all getting complicated. We're packing the model, but the thing is, yeah, so that's like what the problem is, right? The model itself that basically the server sends, we don't have to tell the client that it applied thrust. The client has to tell us, the client has to tell the server that it applied thrust. So I'm just going to go really willy-nilly here, and I'm just going to like to really just, I'm going to have a bunch of errors, but we'll get through this. We got about a few minutes left. Don't need the flags anymore. Don't need this. So we never actually ever sending this with the player model. So why, and then this packed player model still has this, which we should remove. No, that's not what I'm trying. I'm trying to go to the proto. So the player model thing, we want to remove this there, the flags, because that's going to be part of the input. So we don't have this anymore. Gone. All right. So now we have applied thrust, and obviously a bunch of stuff breaks. So basically here, if player applied thrust, then reset it, right? If it's not 0, yeah, it's the same thing. So reset it. Okay. Let's go to the next error. The applied thrust source we don't set it on the player. We'll deal with that later in another place. So this is also like something that I wanted to get rid of, because what this means is like if you're using gestures, you have an advantage. Right, you can apply more thrust in one's what's happening here? How did this change? Why? Okay. Right, we want to be able to just say you apply thrust, and the amount of thrust should be the same no matter if you're using a keyboard or like if you're on the phone or something. So all right. Okay. Now we're getting to the meat. Now in the player controller, if you apply thrust, we increase the velocity, but basically we're going to take the thrust force. Final double applied, or we just call it thrust force, and the game is going to have to pass it in. All right, so then we say required this thrust force. Okay, so now we have this, and then basically after that the player will not have applied the thrust, and here we basically just say thrust force, right? Okay, so now we got it compiling, but what we need to do though is we still need to pass this in, the thrust force. Still need to pass it in. And the thing is though that I think we need to multiply it with dt. Well, actually we don't. That has really nothing to do with time, right? This is like a thrust that you applied, it changes your velocity once. It's not like how long did you apply thrust for. So yeah, so it doesn't need dt actually. So then we look at where we call this. So we say thrust force, and we say game props dot, and so we have a get gesture, and we'll just take this one for now, and we will name it player thrust force. Right, and then we delete the other one. Player thrust force. Then we had the gesture for thrust, which we don't want anymore. And so we shouldn't add thrust. Oh yeah, we don't want this anymore. So that's also kind of weird. We might want to change this to just like say yes, you applied thrust or something. For now, we're just checking in the. Yeah, this is kind of stupid in a way now, because we're giving it like we can add more and more thrust. Okay, so that's fine. This should work. So I want to get to the point where we are happy because we're compiling again. So let's regenerate this. And I want to actually just be able to restart the server and run, and make sure that this doesn't blow up for some reason. Okay, so that's what I was talking about, right? Things like that. So we want to fix that, and then we can probably keep going in the next episode. Okay, if player applied thrust. Okay, yeah. So I was already thinking if we may have to make sure that it is never undefined or null. So actually, let me do it this way. Okay, so let's just do a hard restart in this guy. All right. Still having a problem here. Synchronizer. Oh, this one also we should start it out to be false. Oh, it's by the way, yeah. So we're missing something here, right? So once we submit player inputs, we need to reset the applied thrust to be false, right? And that's why it makes sense to have it all here, because this is clearly like related to when we're actually sending things. Like, right? So basically we kind of keep applied thrust true if it ever was applied, and then when we finally send the inputs, we send it, and actually we need to also send it applied thrust. And so once we send it, then we can say, okay, now we can set it back to false, because now we're going to wait for the player to press it again, apply thrust again. So let's see if this is now happier. It seems happier. So rotation still works. Obviously, thrust doesn't work yet, but we definitely, so we can basically say that we prepared sending applied thrust to the server. The server then will have to go ahead and basically do something, right? The same that we did for rotation, where we basically sync the player. Well, actually, the server now has to basically apply the thrust force on the player velocity, right? So the velocity will change. And this is here in this update method. So actually, we might say that if you unpack it correctly, we could actually... Okay, so the player model... So yeah, we could actually send this on the player model. So actually, we might actually be able to do this quickly. So let's see. When we pack... So we never send that it applied thrust. That's not important. But when we unpack it, when we actually get the player model... Hold on a second. No, this is not... We can't do this here. The applied thrust, this is confusing. The applied thrust is basically just used used on the server side, like for the model. And for the inputs, it's used on the client side. So it's a little bit confusing. But so basically where we did this sync in the... Was it in the game loop? I think so. Game loop. We had a sync player or something. Right, so that was here. So, and now if we go here and say that... So we can first of all say this is a player. Right, and so we can say player, and then we can dot applied thrust equals inputs dot applied thrust. And now why is it confused? Oh, because it wants us to even... Okay, that's fine. We can do that. So it wants us to basically do... Like, put this all together. Okay, now what we can do, we can try to restart the server and then restart the client. Actually, I'm actually a little bit wrong. We need to actually tell the client that the thrust was now applied. So we may need to, but what we should maybe see is if this is working, at least partially. Now, if I apply thrust, I should start moving. But that didn't really work, did it? So that is fine. We will basically dig into that more in the next episode, right? So basically right now we are sending this to the server And we'll make sure of that, obviously, by debugging and so on. And then we basically have to talk about like what do we need to actually include. So basically, when we pack the player model on the server to send it back to the client, we actually need to include, and I'm actually going to put that here already, applied thrust. But you can see that we removed it, and so we may actually need to add it back in. So let me actually go to the proto, because I don't want to remove something that then we ended up needing. So okay, so that's why we had the player flags. Now I understand, because we were sending. Yeah, we'll see about it. I'll keep it removed for now. I want to think about a better way. Maybe the player. What could happen is the player could actually already apply the animation, even though the server hasn't received it yet, because there's no. I mean, just applying the thrust animation, that doesn't allow you to cheat or anything. And then once the server actually responds, because really what we're worried about is where the player is, what's the velocity, and stuff like that, right? So the client, we could have done the same for the rotation, but there's really not much to gain there. But for the thrust, it really makes no sense. The thrust, like that, applied thrust, that's just important to kick off on the server a velocity change of the player, and then on the client to kick off an animation. And then the server comes back with a player model updated with the velocity changed, and so that's all we need actually. And then maybe we can just show on the client, we show a thrust animation. So that should fine. That should work fine. So so let's check that in. And we did a lot of changes here. Looks like yeah, because we changed applied thrust around, right? From okay. So we can say we can actually syncing applied thrust to a server, and why does it keep doing that? As part of that, made applied thrust a boolean instead of thrust force double. Okay, so that's good. Check that in. I'm going to tag this as the end of this episode. And then this concludes for today. And then basically next episode, we'll get into actually applying the thrust to the player on the server, and that will then change the velocity, and then our player should actually start flying. Controlled by the server, right? So basically the server will have the velocity, it will send the client the velocity, so the client can actually start also emulating that behavior, because the updates from the server will not come in all the time, but the server will then still like emulate it as well, and then basically show the update, or like send the update positions to the client. And that's what we'll do next episode, so make sure you watch again, and thanks for watching.